Hey guys, it's Paul, combat veteran, MMA fighter, YouTuber, and today we are checking out another one of Luetin's awesome lore videos. This one is on the Volcano Cannon. Volcano Cannon. The photonic sword of the Omnissiah. I think the Mechanicus doesn't get enough love in a lot of my videos, so I am super into checking this out. So, let's get into it. Oh, okay. I'm also going to have to, maybe hum over a lot of the musical interludes because I keep getting copyright claims on them. Also, while this is going on, you guys should absolutely check out my merch store. I've got shirts, right? You can see I've got mugs, I've got stickers, I've got everything else you could want. Okay. Wow, this is seriously dramatic. Yeah. Okay, I appreciate the rain effects he's got going on. Yeah, wow. This is a lot for Luke, actually. Yeah, this is a lot more like cinematic than I'm used to Luke doing. Big,
when
dramatic.
Faced by the 41st millennium's greatest horrors, from the depths of the warp to the fringes of known space, the Imperium of Man often turns to its most powerful weapons. Together, they embody its tried and true maxim: if it doesn't work, build bigger. And therein we find the Volcano Cannon, so named for its ability to turn solid rock into rivers of flowing lava. The Volcano Cannon is among the most powerful laser weapons fielded by the Imperium, superseded only by the Lance-type laser batteries employed by planetary defences and the ships of the Imperial Navy, the Navis Imperialis. Its sheer size, recoil and power consumption demand its fitting.
Wait. Recoil? A laser cannon should not have recoil because it's a laser, right? Remember, the physics of a firearm is that you have a bullet in the chamber of a weapon, it explodes, and because of the shape of the chamber, of course, the explosion is concentrated in two directions. One is unloaded backwards into the rifle, pushing the stock into your shoulder, and an equal amount of energy is transferred forwards, but down that pipe into a tiny particle projectile, right? And so that act of the bullet being pushed forward and the entire firearm, the entire unit of the gun being pushed backwards is the physics of a bullet. That's what causes the recoil. But a laser doesn't have mass, right? Just like if the bullet had zero, if there was no propellant, and there was no explosion to push the two masses apart, then you wouldn't have recoil. You might have some other effect, right? You may have a heat buildup of some kind, but I don't think you would necessarily have a recoil like what he's describing. But again, at least this is how a conventional, if it truly is a laser weapon, that's how it should work. But again, the lore of 40k is weird, and the physics are weird, and it wouldn't shock me if it had recoil for some other lore-based reason.
To only the largest and most robust Imperial vehicles, such as the Shadow Sword and various class of Titan. Like most laser-based weapons, its primary purpose is armor-piercing, literally melting its way through countless layers of plasteel and ceramite, and when it is deployed against heavy vehicles or even groups of smaller vehicles, they may very often be simply vaporized instantly. Even Titans, protected by void shields and clad in adamantium, the strongest material known to man, are vulnerable to the devastating power of the Volcano Cannon. A single blast against a Titan may cause it to lose entire limbs and major functionality to a well-aimed blast. For the smaller Warhound class Titans may see them destroyed completely. A direct hit will leave nothing but a smoking pair of legs, or worse, a catastrophic meltdown of its reactor, creating a massive detonation, leveling friendly units within even a fairly peripheral proximity.
Oh, that's interesting. That's the exact same mechanic, actually, as some of the BattleTech games, right? Where if you take enough damage to your torso, your reactor goes critical and blows. I think it can also damage nearby friendly units, but that tended not to show up in the video games. I think probably because the programming for it was pretty hard.
Like many of the Imperium's most impressive weapons, the exact origins of the Volcano Cannon are unclear and may most likely originate in some form out of the Dark Age of technology. The key to its modern construction can be found in a single mineral vein on the mining world of Cinderus 11, where a unique crystal lends its focusing properties to the cannon's devastating blast. Following a failed plot by heretic psykers to unseat the planet's governor, the dead heretics' collective psychic energy somehow appeared to have imbued itself in the rocks surrounding their bodies, and over countless years geological forces have compressed and concentrated these energies. But the crystal's rarity and devastating results make Cinder...
Okay. See, I was about to say that most crystal formations we can recreate in a lab from their component parts. Sometimes it's more expensive than others, but lab-grown diamonds, people say that you can detect the differences, but chemically there isn't any. Lab-grown diamonds are the exact same thing, and while jewelers will get salty, right? People who want nice diamonds will pout and stomp their feet if they think that their diamond wasn't dug up by a sufficiently oppressed young African child. For industrial purposes, lab-grown diamonds are A-okay, right? They're able to be infused into tools and drill bits and dies, and it gives them a phenomenal amount of hardness. But again, even in the modern era, there's not a lot of crystalline formations that we couldn't recreate in a lab if we really had to. And so I was going to be surprised that 40K doesn't have the same set of rules. But of course, when you add in the Deus Ex Machina of the warp, then there you go, right? You just sprinkle a little warp on any plot hole, and it just heals itself magically.
11 of immense strategic value to the Imperium, followed by the small handful of Forge worlds which produce the cannon itself: Esteban 3, Griffin 4, Phaeton, and of course Mars. The Volcano Cannon has undergone a series of developments since the years of the Great Crusade. Its first variant, Mark I, apparently proved way too volatile for practical use, much like the successor Mark II, which, despite its improved reliability...
Wait, how? Okay, so when did the heretic psykers try to take over the world? Oh, I guess it would have been during the start of the fall of the Dark Age of technology? Because I thought psykers didn't show up until the tail end of the Dark Age of technology, right? That sort of precipitated the fall, among other things. So how could you invent the Volcano Cannon before you had the psykers making the precursor component of the Volcano Cannon?
completely
Oh yeah, because the warp altered time, right? The warp also lets chronology get goofy. Obviously, the planet just traveled through time.
Destroyed the arms of Titans and the hulls of tanks that carried it. The Mark IV Phaeton pattern is most commonly seen across the Imperium's battlefields today, which, despite being a step down in power from the Mark II, remains utterly devastating. Even the 4 massive purpose-built capacitors on the Imperial Guard's shadow swords are completely drained by a single shot of the weapon, and its blast is sometimes described as a linear sun by the way it can turn night into day, blinding friend and foe alike.
That's actually pretty wild. There actually is a sort of similar effect that we see now in the U.S. Navy's railgun system on things like the Zumwalt. And the railgun is, of course, the idea is to have a tungsten projectile that it doesn't need propellant, but it accelerates down a track throughout the barrel and demands a tremendous volume of energy because you have to draw in enough electrical power to accelerate this, again, tungsten projectile. But the appeal is that there's no propellant, right? You couldn't have an internal ammo explosion of any kind. You don't have to carry big, bulky rounds. And so the payoff felt huge, but the problem the Navy ran into is exactly what this tank runs into, which is you can fire the railgun, but it demands almost all the electrical power of the ship, right? Meaning that other key systems have to get compromised or shut down or operate on a lower power mode. And they never were able to quite, I think, engineer the problem out, though I'm not certain. If you have any naval warfare experts, let me know in the comments. I know the Navy abandoned the railgun very recently, deeming it unfeasible, but I don't know if it was actually because of the huge power drain on systems or if there was some other problem they ran into.
The hardened systems of Leman Russ and Baneblade tanks alike are overwhelmed by the massive release of energy, overloading and requiring time to reboot. Rocks and metal are instantly vaporized, and even the air itself will be ignited, potentially incinerating any nearby infantry and reportedly driving some survivors insane. In a perhaps relevant tangent, the weapon's hypersonic crackling has been speculated to contain the final screams of Cinderus 11's dead heretic psychers, not entirely dissimilarly to the rumours surrounding the Quake cannon. But this is of course great concern to those who monitor any such effects upon Imperial operators, and while continual assessment of Shadow Sword and Titan crews have resulted in no reports of adverse behaviour, the Imperium still considers it necessary to order periodic purges of escorting infantry, and by purge you can assume this means execution of likely loyal and well-serving Imperial troops. Still, within the scale of the Imperium, this is deemed more than an acceptable price to pay for the Volcano Cannon's presence on the battlefield.
That's just great. Only the Imperium would just, as a precaution, with no supporting data, purge a bunch of infantry.
Of course, such great power does come at a cost. Like the weapon itself, the huge vehicles to which it must be mounted tend to be unwieldy and rare.
The one thing I do want to point out is that eventually Imperial Guard troops would probably catch on, and there would just be general rumors that people would take as fact, right, in the absence of better guidance, and would probably actively want to avoid volcano cannons. There'd probably also be unfounded rumors that's oh, the Imperium will kill you if you look at the volcano cannon, or the Inquisition will take you away if you spend too much time touching the tank, right? Things that are sort of vaguely in the same ballpark as correct, but based on speculation.
The Shadow Sword's capacitors can barely support the Volcano Cannon's power consumption, being completely depleted by even a single firing and rendering the tank temporarily immobile and vulnerable. Recharging for a second shot can take even up to 2 minutes, and the weapon's huge size also requires it to be mounted directly to the hull, meaning the entire vehicle must turn in order to acquire targets or keep track of moving ones. More maneuverable opponents may be impossible to engage at all, and this paired with the tank's limited mobility means it must be escorted at all times. As such, the Shadow Sword's Volcano Cannon is best designated as a scaled-up tank destroyer, a weapon purpose-built to eliminate enemy armoured targets and Titans in particular. For all the Volcano Cannon...
I remember there was some YouTuber who said that that's an excellent way to deal with Titans. Just put a Titan-sized gun on a tank. Pretty weird. Sounds like that dude knew what he was talking about.
Cannon's expense and rarity, the Shadow Sword is one of only a few weapons the Imperial Guard can use to counter the Titans, that is, short of masses of weaker but concentrated firepower. But Titans represent some of the most expensive projects undertaken by the Imperium and can take centuries to construct. They represent a massive commitment to any given battlefield, and so a critical strike by a well-placed Volcano Cannon can turn the tide of a battle against the heretics or loyalists, or even against an entire planetary campaign. Unfortunately for the Guard, by the 41st millennium, the Shadow Sword has grown increasingly rare due to the complexity of building and operating the main gun. To make matters worse, each Volcano Cannon can survive only 1500 shots before becoming dangerously volatile. Consequently, while the Volcano Cannon excels at destroying heavy fortifications or super heavy tanks, most Guard commanders are wary of deploying the weapon outside of its main Titan killer role.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense given the fact that it has a tremendous cost not only to the system itself, but to its users and accompanying guardsmen. So, yeah, that kind of makes sense that you just really want to be conservative with it. 1,500 shots may sound like a lot, but again, I imagine if you're talking about a tank having to engage, an orc invasion, for example, for a decade, then it could potentially, firing it 1,500 times would be basically one shot a month for 10 years.
Even rarer and more prized was the Shadow Sword's cousin, the Falchion, which roamed the battlefields of the early Imperium. In a ludicrous display of firepower, the Falchion featured a pair of twin-linked Volcano Cannons, though exactly how the tank's capacitors supported the weapon's function is unclear. Even the massive plasma reactor of the Warlord-class Titan can barely support multiple Volcano Cannons, but perhaps the necessary technology has simply been lost to time since the early days of the Crusade.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. The more you dig into lore, the more you realize just that the Imperium is just slowly attriting away. And, you know, you hope that having someone with a little bit of vision, like Robute show up, will allow the Imperium to start to make some forward progress. You know, it's interesting that, you know, the Warhammer 40k is definitively grimdark, but the idea that the Imperium is fundamentally losing is tough, I think, to sell to fans, right? Nobody wants to play for the losing faction, and the Imperium getting a little technologically more backward every year, right? Its enemies gaining a little bit more of a foothold every year is, you know, demotivating, right? And so now it's interesting to see that they've got, you know, Robute trying to unify the Imperium, right? A decisive change. Of course, you've got the Great Rift, giving Chaos a real shot at splitting its, you know, enemy, the Imperium. The Silent King has returned for the Necrons, giving them a real shot at reclaiming the galaxy. So it's interesting. Even Belarius Call out there, you know, actually doing some forward engineering, actually making a new class of you know, Space Marine, the Ultramarines. But it's fun that GW is like finally going to let many of the factions gain in power instead of becoming less and less effective over time.
The Falchion variant was assigned specifically for Astartes use and was designated during this period as a super heavy tank destroyer. It combines technologies used from both the Fellblade and Shadow Swords, and the completely insane power of 2 Volcano Cannons meant that this vehicle was an extremely high investment resource for a single unit, and so very few were produced. In the modern period of M41, it's unknown how many Falchion destroyers have survived, but their extreme rarity will place them as some of the most highly prized weapons and only be used as relic weaponry. Their deployment to battle is almost unheard of in the modern Imperium, but it can happen. And should a chapter deem it necessary, such a vehicle will be heavily supported by additional units, and its sheer firepower is more than capable of turning a battle for the Space Marines, even while they face far superior numbers.
I mean, that's sort of interesting that something so precious to the Imperium is placed under the control of chapters. It seems like chapters are like woefully understaffed and underqualified to make decisions about the deployment of such a critical resource, right? Because obviously, a chapter, if they get overrun in whatever battle they're in, because there's only 1,000 of them, it wouldn't take much, they're going to choose to save themselves by deploying their greatest weapon. But you have to think about the strategic big picture of the Imperium, right? The Imperium may need a Titan killer to stave off Chaos forces or an Orc invasion, but if the Space Marine chapter that controls it is dealing with Tyranids, then that very valuable technology is going to be used less effectively against Tyranids who, you know, I think in lore are a little less likely to roll out Bio-Titans. So I see that sort of stuff, and it's just, I mean, this is classic Imperium, right? Divide your command into 1,000,000 parts and make sure there's no unity of effort or overall strategic thinking.
Its rarity also additionally can give the Astartes in M41 an element of both surprise and stunned shock by their enemies. The power of a twin Volcano Cannon is not something seen perhaps ever by some enemies the Imperium face, such as the Tau, and the insane power of a super heavy Falchion destroyer would inevitably leave any of the most powerful Xenos war machines vaporized or cut to pieces before battle had barely even begun. But the use of the Falchion destroyer was well demonstrated during the Great Crusade itself, when newfound enemies of humanity, now long since dead and forgotten, were exposed for the first time to the sheer power of the Imperium. The Falchion itself was developed long before the period of the Heresy, and in this time it was not designated to counter or engage the Titans, which would become almost exclusively its battlefield role later. As the Great Crusade encountered ever more well-equipped and resistant Xenos, or even some human enclaves, some of the war machines that were used to resist the new Imperium were of a scale which required significantly more apocalyptic firepower. One such species were the bizarre beings of the so-called Scion Reach, who were so massive they could crush entire deployments with their bulk alone. But when an Astartes force of Ultramarines engaged them with Falchion super heavy destroyers, they were set ablaze in a horrifying display of ostentatious Imperial might. The Xenos were not only the ones though to see the true power of the Imperium in this time, and the Iron Hands Legion were forced to deploy Falchions against the fortresses of the Thulos Deeps, who had rejected Imperial compliance. After the Iron Hands had finished their engagement, all that remained was charred rubble or liquefied rock. If nothing else, the Falchion super heavy destroyer was a potent display of Imperial power.
Yeah, always funny that the Emperor of Man is seen as the best force for good, and he really kills a lot of people. And I can't speak to whether or not this other side was good. I mean, here's the thing, right? This is Warhammer 40k, and this is like the real world. It's like there's definitely better, right? It's better to be in the Imperium as a human being than to be, in a world controlled by Tyranids, because they're just going to eat you. But to say that there is a good guy doesn't make any sense, right? So who knows who the good guys were in this scenario, right? The protagonists are going to be the Iron Hands, but some random faction that everyone's forgotten about. They undoubtedly were not good. They undoubtedly did bad things at some point in their history. Maybe they were even worse than the Imperium, but maybe not. Maybe they just were politely said no thanks to the Imperium and then got, turned into slag.
And a single deployment could be more than sufficient to turn a resistant human planet into a state of begrudging compliance as a member of the new and all-encompassing empire of the Emperor's Imperium. It is well known, of course, that tanks are not the only mount available for a Volcano Cannon. Its vast energy consumption is best supported by the plasma reactors of Battle Titans, and these allow one or more to be fitted to a single machine, though the Volcano Cannon is still too demanding for the smaller Warhound class Titans. But it is on these Titans that the weapon's power truly shines, enabling a potent combination of range, firepower and mobility that can stop entire armoured battalions in their tracks. As such, while Titans are themselves rare, the Volcano Cannon is among the most common of weapons mounted on their hardpoints or carapace, and there are several variations in keeping with the Titan's size, from those designated for the Reaver class Titan to the Bellicosa Volcano Cannon, a variety of truly spectacular destructive power, as well as fielding double the range. The Bellicosa is a rarity within a rarity, most seen during the days of the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy, and like seemingly so many things of decreasing number since.
Yep. Yeah. It's just strange. Again, talking about the Titans really evokes for me the U.S. military's love of the supercarrier in the way that they were originally in World War II. They were meant as support ships, right? They were meant as non-battling ships that offered a contingent of aircraft that could be used for scouting and occasionally bombing purposes. And after the attack on Pearl Harbor, right, the U.S. Pacific Fleet lost a lot of its battleships, right, the previous flagships of their navy. And so as a sort of strategic choice, the U.S. Navy was like, okay, we're going to emphasize our carriers because that's what's left, and we're going to double down. We're going to make the carriers the primary battle group in our Navy. And the result, of course, was a very effective naval warfare protocol, right? Very interesting one, right? You had these battles where the ships would not see each other, but their fighters would engage one another. And, of course, here we are 70 years later, and the U.S. Navy is even more fixated on carriers and carrier strike groups. But these are 10 or $100 billion ships so expensive that they really can't afford to lose them. And if they did lose a carrier in a real conflict, the time and cost to build a new one probably wouldn't be worth it, right? The carrier might not be seaworthy for another decade, right? That could be the entirety of a war. And so you end up in this sort of parity situation where, yeah, you have this many carriers and you're not really going to build new ones. And in a really intense war, you may lose carriers much faster than you can replace them. And you wonder why. Like, why put all your eggs in these 12 baskets? And I asked that question for Titans, where you're just like, how many more Bane Blades or Super Tanks could you make with the same amount of effort you put into these, like, Titans?
The Bellicosa is a large enough and demanding weapon that it may only be fitted to the massive Warlord-class Battle Titan, or of course the god among god engines, the Imperator. The Imperator's immense hulk can support as many as 6 Volcano Cannons, a truly obscene level of firepower. If a single Volcano Cannon is enough to cripple a smaller Titan or blow open a hardened fortress, 6 could eliminate an entire conventional army, a whole banner of Imperial Knights, or a maniple of smaller Titans. Where most of a Titan's weapons are devastating in their own way, from the Sun Fury Plasma Annihilator to the equally large Quake Cannon, the thing that truly sets the Volcano Cannon apart is its combination of range, precision and relative reliability. While the Sun Fury can fire in overwhelming bursts, it is at best a medium-range weapon, and the Quake Cannon's blast is incomparable. But a Titan's Volcano Cannon can be focused against key defensive hardpoints or individual moving vehicles and carve away another Titan's limbs like a heretic being prepared for conversion to a life of servitor servitude. Without the
Nice, Luetin. Nice.
Shadow Sword's 2-minute cooldown and immobility, a Titan's Volcano Cannon can also keep up a steady, if slow, enfilade of fire, making it a much more reliable and adaptable weapon on a changing battlefield. And unlike the Quake Cannon's shells or the Plasma Annihilator's energy, its concentrated beam also requires no travel time and can be used to target enemies even at a close range, because its potential for friendly fire and other unintended consequences is relatively limited. Especially compared to the Quake Cannon, a weapon known to open fissures which could swallow entire regiments alive. Plus, as an energy weapon, it will never run out of shells, though anything less than an Imperator Titan will need to be careful not to overtax its reactor should its crew choose to mount 2 Volcano Cannons together. Another iteration or...
Yeah, I kind of enjoy the idea of tweaking loadouts for every campaign or every mission. That's a staple, again, of the MechWarrior franchise. Is that possible in tabletop play? Can you equip your Titan with certain weapon loadouts prior to an engagement? And if so, what are the trade-offs, like lore and gameplay experts? What sort of like mixes do you commonly see on Titans?
Or one might say a close relation to the Titan's Volcano Cannon is the Knight Castellan's Volcano Lance. This is a slightly smaller weapon, but with almost as much destructive power. Although a Titan or a Shadow Sword's Volcano Cannon may pack a more powerful punch, to say nothing of the Bellicosa, the Castellan's relative speed and maneuverability means that the weapon can be employed with far more finesse. Fixed defences can be bypassed a tank, or Titan's weaker flanks can be targeted, and its smaller size might allow it to avoid the instant concentration of firepower a massive Titan might receive. A Volcano Lance might even remain useful in situations where Volcano Cannon would be a liability, such as urban or forested combat. And while the cannon is still king in terms of firepower, the Lance is a far more adaptable weapon with its own combat niche. But then to scale things up on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the Defense Laser, which is a fixed weapon designated for planetary defense. Without going too much into detail on this topic, because the defense laser beams are far more in common with the Lance-type weapons on Imperial starships, but older reference concerning Volcano Cannons, specifically the original Adeptus Titanicus, referred to them as defense lasers. Now, we might just read into this as a case of ever-changing lore or even a mistake, but it's certainly interesting to speculate whether the Volcano Cannon might have once been employed in a purely defensive capacity. Its drawbacks, namely power consumption and recoil, would be completely solved by a large fortification's ferrocrete foundations and built-in huge reactors. it's certainly reasonable to assume that a base's power plant, without the weight limitations imposed by a Titan's mobility requirements, could support multiple such demanding weapons. An argument, though, against this is the idea that there are very few targets large enough to warrant such a weapon to be used to engage with, and so it would be a waste for such a rare weapon to remain in a fixed position and unable to be deployed where it is most needed. That's the benefit of the more mobile units, either tanks or Titans.
That's actually an excellent point. Again, it's like you have to weigh the value of the thing you're defending against the defenses that you allocate to it, especially permanently.
However, this also doesn't take into consideration that the Volcano Cannon's likely period of creation was during either the Dark Age of Technology or the Age of Strife, although in this period it may well have been known by another name and perhaps even a slightly different variant.
Right, it would have to be because, again, you don't have heretic psychers until the Age of Strife, right?
During this era, such weapons were almost certainly easier to produce, and battle machines on the scale of Titans were far more common than in later millennia.
I mean, I guess it's also possible that the manufacturing capabilities of humanity's Age of Technology were better able to create facsimiles, or better able to create this sort of crystal formations that the dead heretics were able to imbue sort of by accident. Sort of like how, again, you can mine uranium. Well, it's not a good example. I don't know. I can't think of an example in the real world where you have something that can be produced artificially much more easily, but is very hard to find in nature. Again, thankfully, so far in human history, we have more or less steadily advanced in technology, and the ability to manufacture something artificially is generally not lost, not permanently at least.
Also, power availability and so on would have been perhaps more efficient and easier. Titans and other super heavy vehicles are often considered base killers, so it only stands to reason that a fortification would have sought a means by which to fire back in kind. In a technological zenith period that was not hamstrung by the many limitations in the age of the Imperium, volcano cannons make sense as a defensive weapon ranking between the planetary defense laser and the turbo laser destructor, if only used for installations of major importance. However, as is always the case in the foggy, dark future of humanity, some early sources do indicate that the defense laser and the volcano cannon have always been essentially the same, and that the versions mounted on Titans as the volcano cannon are in fact stripped down defense lasers. In a certain way, this does make sense, as it would explain why the weapon's evolution occurred after the Dark Age of Technology, when the Mechanicus' distrust of invention had already taken hold. And remember that for the Mechanicus, adapting an existing weapon to a new purpose isn't necessarily banned and heretical, although just how much a piece of tech might be adapted is something of a grey area. This might also help us to explain why the variants from the Mark I to the Mark IV represented decreasing levels of energy.
I've talked about this in other videos. One of the things that seems to define human beings at any era of history is self-interest. And if it is in the interest of the wider Imperium that certain modifications to existing technology be declared not heretical, i.e. you invent a lighter or more efficient volcano cannon, for example, the potential payoff would be so great that everyone would know that they need to declare this particular invention simply a modification of existing technology, and that the naysayers that claim it is too much of a modification and constitutes new technology on its own, they are just extremists and don't need to be listened to, right? That's how these things tend to go. The message always lines up with your position, or often.
Instead,
or your interests, I should say,
of the inverse. Remembering that the Mark II was so powerful, it literally destroyed any vehicle it was mounted on, including Titan's arms. Knowing the uncertainty, secrets and clashing histories always present in the 40k verse, coupled with the Imperium's gradual but inevitable technological decline, it's even possible that the Adeptus Mechanicus had lost the means to truly create volcano cannons millennia ago, and the weapons we see in use across the galaxy today are in fact ancient stripped down defense lasers from ages past. On top of all of this, we have the oddity where it's described that crystal shards created by heretical psykers in the modern Imperium are the only means to create the power of the Volcano Cannon. How does this work? This doesn't seem to fit in the context, it doesn't make sense within the history of the Volcano Cannon. Now, to repeat what I just said, we might consider that the Mechanicus had lost the knowledge of how to produce the power of a volcano cannon that was once a variant used in planetary defensive systems, and that now they can only be made practically operational through the use of these bizarre psi crystals. Or, another explanation I thought of was that perhaps, as we saw through the various failed attempts to create this scaled down weapon through Mark 1, Mark 2, etc., the issue was in lacking the knowledge to reasonably scale down the sheer power of a defense laser. Now, through the use of these psi crystals, which seem to have the property to sort of absorb energy, they may have been the key to what enabled the Mechanicus to successfully produce a battlefield-scaled defense laser, a volcano cannon, and so perhaps these crystals help to focus or regulate the power and help keep the weapon stable. This would also make sense in terms of the weapon only being able to have 1500 uses, so again, perhaps they can only absorb so much or focus so much energy before they are no longer usable and the crystal has to be replaced.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, again, my theory I'm going to stick with is that they are unable, they understand that there is some sort of crystal at work, and in the Dark Age of technology, humanity was able to artificially manufacture that crystal, but in the modern Imperium, the only place they can find it naturally occurring, is, of course, in this extremely unique circumstance. It sort of reminds me a little bit of actually nuclear fission. Believe it or not, it is theoretically possible, and I believe there's maybe 2 locations in the world where basically uranium deposits are underground but deposited in such a way, in such an appropriate composition of dirt, that they accidentally become a low output fission reactor, right? The fission reaction keeps on going, seemingly infinitely. And it, again, you would in theory have found an infinite source of power. However, it's way, way, way easier now for us to manufacture a fission reactor. But again, if 100,000 years in the future, if we've forgotten as a species how to manufacture a nuclear fission reactor, we would literally have to just find these handful of occurring natural fission reactors and just, there'd be no way, right? The only way to you have to scoop it all up and move it. But maybe that's what this is describing, right? A extremely niche natural process doing something that the Dark Age of technology was able to do in a lab.
This is my speculation, but it seems logically reasonable to me. Like so much of the knowledge in the dark future, we likely can never truly know the specifics of such things, for they are so closely guarded by the Imperial administrators, inquisitors and tech priests, or the knowledge has simply been lost across the mists of time and the many millennia that humans continue to endure in these bleakest of ages. Ultimately, regardless of its origins or the more recent iterations, whether brought to the battlefield atop the chassis of a shadow sword, twinned upon a relic Falchian super heavy destroyer, or mounted upon the arm of a reaver, warlord or imperator, the Volcano Cannon exists as a horrifying display of the sheer insanity of human ingenuity, coupled with a terrifyingly brazen willpower to use such a destructive weapon offensively, and very often even against their own kind. In many
I wonder, would it be a war crime to use a volcano weapon in the modern era? I would argue no, since directed energy weapons are not considered a war crime, and most war crime regulations deal with types of ammunition being used. Actually, even more interestingly, that there are distinctions made between anti-vehicle weapons and anti-personnel weapons. So you could, in theory, have an anti-vehicle weapon which would not be acceptable to use on people, and perhaps even vice versa, though I don't know why you would want to protect a vehicle. And it's also really bizarre because it's like you can't use certain types around, like white phosphorus, for example. White phosphorus, totally acceptable to use on a vehicle formation, totally unacceptable to use against dismounted infantry. But who operates a tank or a truck? A person. So you're using white phosphorus on people. The people just have to be in a truck first, right? This is sort of the I don't want to say ridiculousness, right? The law of war is important, but these are some of the things that are sort of like these contradictions that are sort of inherent in the law. And we see here that the Volcano Cannon is also an anti-vehicle weapon. So it would almost certainly be legal, I argue, in the modern era, right? For the same reason that white phosphorus is legal. It's very hot, it burns, it melts right through everything, but as long as you say you're using it against vehicles and not personnel, totally acceptable. Some personnel get hurt by the Volcano Cannon. The law of war says accidents happen.
In many ways, the Volcano Cannon is an embodiment of mankind itself. It's self-assured, unrelenting, and more than willing to destroy itself along with its enemies, rather than to ever admit defeat.
Okay. All right, Luetin. Let's pause it there, right? We don't really need the large musical interlude, right? Good way to get myself copyright claimed. Yeah, this is a wild weapon, but again, not unheard of. It's just so interesting to see something that looks like immature technology, right? And in most of real-world human history, the technology matures over time. Its manufacture gets more efficient. It is able to operate on economies of scale. It is improved in design continuously, right? Look at something like aircraft or early tanks, right? Early tanks were extremely rare, extremely prized on the battlefield, and used very sparingly, both because they were hard to manufacture and because they really didn't want them to fall into enemy hands. Now, and then, of course, you look a decade later, 2 decades later, the tanks were way more mobile, way more reliable, and way more effective. And because they were being manufactured, thanks to manufactured at scale, you were able to see entire tank divisions, entire offensives of just tanks. And so it's interesting, of course, in the Imperium to not see that occur in Warhammer 40k, right, where there's only going to be fewer volcano weapons. The volcano weapons that do exist are going to be less effective, and over time they're going to become more and more sparingly used until eventually they're just not a factor on the battlefield. All right, guys, thank you for watching. Be sure to check out the merch store. Lots of fun merch. Check out the Instagram, the second channel, where I post reaction videos to other things in the gaming universe. And, be sure to check out the podcast I run with my brother covering the UFC and mixed martial arts. All right, guys, that is all I had for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys later.